All right, good morning, good afternoon to everyone, depending on whatever time zone you're in as you listen to our video this morning. It is nearing the end of our review of CDFM Module 1. But as you know, if you look at the test blueprint, you'll see that the majority of the questions for all three CDFM modules are fiscal law related. And so in my study group, I've added the module 3.1 as an added portion of the module 1. However, if you understand what you learn in module 1, you will see that some of that stuff is fiscal law. When you start talking about how you use the appropriations, a 1-year appropriation versus a 3-year or 2-year appropriation, all of those rules associated with those appropriation is part of fiscal law. So I often get people who ask, hey, can you tell me which topics are repeated in all three modules? Basically, the majority of all of them. You cannot independently study for one module without looking into the other modules. So I'm going to repeat, and I hope I try to repeat it each time I get on. I see a chat. I'm sorry. Okay, you're very welcome, Mr. Bingham. So I might get a little slow with the chat because this is being recorded and I have the screen up. I don't have that dual screen, so bear with me. And we want to make sure that you guys are ready. The same approach each time. If you have never taken any of the CDFM, you just started studying, make sure before you schedule and take a module that you've reviewed the other two modules. What am I talking about? We're wrapping up review of CDFM Module 1, but you want to make sure after we're done that you review Module 2 and Module 3. What are you looking for? You're looking for similar topics. If they talk about appropriations in Module 1, or they talk about working capital funds or Article 1 in the Constitution and so forth, look in the other modules. Just flip through, look at the topics. Because again, there may be more information in a Module 3 or Module 2, but you're taking a Module 1 exam. So does everyone understand that? So I'm repeating it for the interest of those that are new to the group or whoever is new watching the video later. So there's really not much new information that's going to be covered in fiscal law. It should be a repetition of some of the things we've already covered. So let's start on page 3.1.7. The slide talks about the basic idea, the basic axiom of fiscal law. The basic idea is simple. In order for you to use an appropriation for a specific purpose, it must be stated by Congress that you can use it. Congress controls. Remember that 3 branches of government we started off in Module 1? It says that Congress has the power of the purse. It controls what money we get and how much and what we can do with those appropriations. So that's the basic rule that we start off with. Let's get the glasses. All right, so fiscal law is based on the premise that appropriations are only available. So in common law, there are differences and kind of like military standards. I know in uniform, we used to say, well, the standard didn't say I couldn't do XYZ, so that means I can do it. It doesn't work the same when you talk about fiscal law. It must be stated, or you can justify what it is that you're buying with those appropriations that's listed and approved by Congress. All right, page 8, 318, automatically, as soon as you see Constitution authority and you see Article 1, that tells you that we're talking to which branch of government. So I'm trying to engage, so anybody can answer. All right, Article 1 of the Constitution talks to which branch of government?
Legislative.
The legislative branch, or what's another name for legislative?
Congress.
Congress. So legislative and Congress, that's the same branch. And I'm saying it because on an exam, when you have multiple names, you may see either or, and I don't want y'all to get confused. And so Article 1, automatically, you know this is addressing Congress. And we went over this in Module 1, if you remember, a few weeks ago. We went through Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3. So Section 7 says Congress can raise revenue. The bills from the Congress to the president can veto. Article 1, Section 8 says Congress can collect, empowers Congress to collect taxes. And then Article 1, Section 9, and this one goes the extra step, it gives you the clause. The one and the reason on the end of March the 8th of 2024, if they don't come up with an appropriation law or another CR, then the government shuts down, because under Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, now you learn something new, requires an appropriation law in order for us to get funding or appropriation out of the treasury. So in Module 1, it only stated Article 1, Section 9. Now that you look in Module 3.1, you see it is actually Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7. Any question on that distinction? So that's the reason you want to review all three modules before you take your first exam. GAO principles of federal appropriation law. Last week we touched on this. The GAO has the GAO red book, yellow book, and green book. Think of a stoplight. That's how I remember things on the exam, is associating with something that's familiar. So the GAO red book deals with federal appropriations law. Anything you want to know about appropriation from the GAO perspective, Government Accountability Office. Make sure you know what GAO stands for, in case a simple question on an exam is the government, what does the acronym GAO stand for? And then they give you 4 selections. When you're nervous on an exam, it always seems like all the answers look correct. And so while you're studying, don't just say the acronym, also spell out what those acronyms stand for. So Government Accountability Office, the GAO Red Book, deals with those specific laws, fiscal law of the appropriation. So nothing new that we've already covered in Module 1, but you're adding some new information later on. On page 9, all right, so let's stay with the red book. All right, so what the yellow book covered? All right, check on learning. Always got to recap. Auditing, and the green book, which we did last week.
Internal control.
Internal control. So always remember your stoplight. Appropriations, auditing, and internal control. On page 9, it starts at the bottom, talks about the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921. And it's important to me to know that law because it provided a couple of things. It required the president to submit the annual budget. Remember that. When does the president have to submit the budget?
February 1st, that first Monday.
Okay. I'll give you half point for that one. February 1st. Is it by February 1st? What's the proper terminology? No later than February.
The first
Monday.
First
Monday. So it's not February 1st. It's no later than the first Monday in February. And so under the Budget and Accounting Act, it required the president to be the one to compile the nation's budget, the federal budget, the president's budget, for all 3 branches of government. The second thing it did, it created the budget office for the president. And the budget office for the president, what's the title?
OMB.
OMB. So Congress has the Congressional Budget Office, the president or the executive branch has OMB. What does OMB stand for?
Of Management and Budget.
Office of Management and Budget. And I'm pointing that out because if you just look at the page, all you see is an acronym. They don't go into, because that means it was already mentioned early on in the study guide. So Office of Management and Budget is responsible for the resource management or financial management at the president level. So that position was also created with the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921. And then the third one is also important because it established the GAO as the oversight body for Congress. That's important because that's why you follow the GAO red book, yellow book, green book, because of that oversight. GAO, Government Accountability Office, is an external auditing agency that provides oversight of the executive budget. So that's a correct statement, or over the president's budget. All of that is still correct. So terminology. So Budget and Accounting Act of 1921, annual budget presented by the president for all three branches, OMB and GAO was created. On page 10, and I don't know if you noticed throughout the study guide, that last one at the bottom of that chart, OMB Circular A11, we touched on it in Module 1. Anytime you see OMB Circular A11, it is talking about budget development, budget formulation, execution, all of that processing is OMB Circular A11. So now you know what OMB is, and we get circulars from OMB. So what type of regulation, policy, or guidance do we get from the Department of Defense? What is the title of those documents? Those are called the DOD instructions. So typically for major topics where you have something from OMB, then at the DOD level, it's called the DOD instructions, DOD. Such as the only one we've studied so far is the 5010.40. All right, sources of authority, page 11. When you use public fund, so the basic foundation for the guidance on the use of these funds is the U.S. Constitution. That's where you get your Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3. And it says on the paragraph on page 11, Article 1 of the Constitution generates the revenue bills. All right, so which part of the Constitution talks about revenues? Which article? Because we just learned it. It's just, you're just seeing it in a different format.
Article 1.
Article 1, what section deals with revenue?
7.
That's correct. Article 1, Section 7, remember, going back a couple pages, Article 1, Section 7 deals with revenue, raising revenue. Article 1, Section 8 deals with taxes. So as you're reading the paragraph in 11, and it talks about generates the revenue bills required to run the government and to establish taxes to fund the same, the taxes are covered in Section 8 and so forth. All right, fund certification should not be new to anyone, but how do you know the difference between a fiduciary certifier and pecuniary? Again, test taken. Fiduciary starts with an F, and you're certifying the right fund. Fund starts with an F. So first of all, tie that together. And pecuniary certifier, they are responsible for the accuracy. So to me, the word pecuniary means you can be punished for certifying these funds because you're actually responsible for dispersing the funds. So if you're a dispersing officer, you are DFAS and you're actual individual that certifies a payment, you'll have pecuniary liability. What does that mean, pecuniary liability? So pecuniary liability. So fiduciary, you're just making sure that you have the right appropriation, you have the right amount. You know, if the appropriation cannot be exceeded by, let's say, $250,000, you can't do a contract for $300,000. So you're making sure all those rules are followed. But pecuniary, because you are certifying the actual disbursement, you are held liable if something comes up later and that was an erroneous payment. You can be held liable to pay those back. So for those of us who've deployed as finance officers or dispersing officers, we had this responsibility. So we had millions of dollars, and if we lose it, then we could be held liable. So that's why you always want to make sure if you get rid of cash, you better have the right document to back it up. So fiduciary certifies the right fund, and pecuniary certifies the disbursement, because they can be punished if that is an erroneous payment. Making sure you have the right document. All right, availability of funds. Yes, this is where our meat and potatoes are. Starting on page 12. Congress controls the funds by using the availability of these resources. Every appropriation has a specific purpose, time, and amount. And so typically in the workplace, if you committed a violation, they'll say you committed an ADA violation. Well, you have to now with the CDFM look a little bit deeper and say, what type of violation did they violate? And so purpose is covered in the 31 U.S. Code, Chapter 13, Section 1. So 31 U.S. Code 1301 deals with purpose. And we're going to look at what it says. Time is covered in 31 U.S. Code 1502. Amount has 3 sections in the ADA, Anti-Deficiency Act, 31 U.S. Code 1341, 1342, and 1517. Anytime you have a list of things in the study guide, you got to know the difference, because if it's jumbled in a puzzle and it says which violation did this individual violate? So, okay, I'm using the same word, but you know what I'm saying. Did they violate purpose? Did they violate time or amount? Based on the knowledge of the description. And so purpose begins on page 13, 3113. And it states, exactly, appropriation shall be applied only to the objects for which the appropriations were made, except as otherwise provided by law. You need to put these things in your own word, translated. And purpose is straightforward. The appropriation that you use must be, whatever it is you're trying to buy, must be directly related to the appropriations being used. So specific purpose, whether you're using milpers, that means you should be paying military personnel. The only miscellaneous one you can say is your O&M, operations and maintenance, because that's where you deal with your training and all of those mission requirements, but you still have to make sure that it aligns. So purpose should be straightforward. 31 U.S. Code 1301. So what I do when I study page 12 is I learn that chart at the top. Purpose, 31 U.S. Code 1301. Time, 1502. Amount, 1341, 1342, 1517. Just say that a few times. So purpose is 1301. When dealing with purpose on page 3114, you have some general operating expenses. I talked about training when you go to TDY, temporary duties, travel, postage, books, miscellaneous. That's the list that I gave earlier. Then you have on page 15 some specific statutes or specific limitations or guidance that may be added on to the general rule. So who can add these specific authorities on the appropriation? Who can? What are the entities that can add specific purpose on the appropriations? If nothing else, you should say Congress, right? Because Congress controls the appropriations. And so Congress gives specific restrictions they can add to the Authorization Act. Remember when in Module 1, we talked about budget resolution process where Congress determines the guidelines they're going to review the president's budget, the Authorization Act, where they authorize the programs. Within that act, they can put restrictions on the programs, not just give you a list of programs, they might have restrictions on those programs. Appropriation, that's where we get our actual funding or appropriations law. So that's where we get our budget authority. That's another law by Congress. And CG decisions. So I got my commanding general decision. Is that correct? CG decision. I'm looking at the slide on the top of page 15. Does CG here stand for commanding general?
No.
Okay. So I hear a no. So then what does it stand for?
Comptroller?
Comptroller, what's the
General.
Comptroller General? All right, so we're getting somewhere. Okay, and Comptroller General works for whom? What organization do they work for?
Is it the GAO?
It sounds like a question, but yes, that's the GAO. So the Comptroller General is the title of the individual in charge of the GAO. You got to be able, that's why every time I move along and I see something, I got to be able to answer it. So when you see CG decision in this study guide, it is never commanding general. In most other instances, it is. You need the commander's decision. In the study guide, it is Comptroller General. Comptroller General is the title of the individual in charge of the GAO, Government Accountability Office. As we just stated, the GAO is an oversight body that works directly for Congress. Because again, you can give people rules all day. Like you have children and you tell them, you could do this, but you cannot do this. I promise you, if you don't check the don't list, one or two of them are doing what's on your don't list. So the GAO for the government comes in to make sure we are following and adhering to the don't list. Any question on that? Specific purpose authority. So those are the laws. Remember the budgeting process that helps to guide what we can do. So purpose again, 31 U.S. Code 1301. Repetitive, that's how you remember. All right, page 3116, still talking about purpose. When you're looking and trying to figure out the right appropriation to pay for something, you need to apply the necessary expense doctrine. What it is a three-part test. So on an exam, if I'm writing an exam, I'm going to say which one is not a part of the three-part test for the necessary expense doctrine. So you got to know what the three are. The first one says, whatever it is that I'm trying to buy must bear a logical relationship to the appropriation that I'm trying to use. Number two says, I got to make sure that what I'm trying to buy was not already prohibited in some law, whether it's in the appropriation or the authorization law. Is there a law that says I cannot make this purchase? That's the second thing you look at. And the third thing you look at is being efficient, is making sure that whatever I'm trying to buy is not already provided in, let's say, the supply system. That you go to your supply clerk and you order it in the system. Is it otherwise provided for? There's some other channel that's already out there. So getting a contract should not be your first decision. Using the government purchase card should not be your first choice. You may already have the item in your supply system. And so 3-part test: logical relationship to what I'm trying to buy. The appropriation cannot be prohibited by law to make that purchase, and it cannot be funded elsewhere. If funds are already provided to do that mission and I just want more funding, I cannot then turn around and go to the funding that I have to make sure that I add to what's already provided. So that's purpose. 31 U.S. Code 1301. On page 17, now it moves on to time. Every appropriation has a specific timeline that they're good for new obligations. So time is covered on the 31 U.S. Code 1502. So just saying something violate the 31 U.S. Code is not enough. For CDFM, you need to know, is it violating purpose, time, or amount? So every appropriation is specific purpose. So let's move on to, I'll come back to that. The balance of a fixed term appropriation is available only for payment of expenses properly incurred during the period of availability or to complete contracts properly made within that period. Let's say I cannot just simply, if I have prior year funds and I have a new project I want to do today, I cannot take the prior year funds to start that new project. This is saying 31 U.S. Code 1502 says I have to have already started got an awarded contract. And then if I need additional funding, I can increase or decrease those funds, but I cannot start any new contract after it expires. So when you deal with time on page 18, you got to apply the bona fide needs rule. When do you really need that item? And the best way for me to explain it is on page 19, to understand services. So you have severable services and you have non-severable. First, let's get the definition out the way. A severable service is something that you begin that if you end that service, you still would have received a benefit for the government up to that point. The best example is a maintenance or housekeeping. Like for the building I'm in, they have a cleaning service. Every Thursday, the cleaning service comes on our floor, they clean. So if that contract ends next week, this week we receive a benefit. Severable service, I can end it, end it. A non-severable service is a job that once it starts, I have to complete the entire job to receive a benefit for the government. The example listed here as a severable is training. Whenever you go to school or you have a training calendar, just like this individual expect to show up to one day of class and pass the CDFM, or expect to only attend these classes, look at my video and pass it without spending time with it. You have to apply whatever this training schedule says, all of it, to get that certificate at the back end. That's non-severable. So I'm still on bona fide need. Now let's go back to severable. What you need to know, the reason you need to know what's severable and non-severable is because knowing this information means now I can give you a practical exercise. If I'm writing the test, I don't have to tell you it's a severable service, but let's say I say you have a cleaning service and this contract is a 13-month contract. and I ask you, how much funding do you obligate today? So I'll give you dollar amounts, and then you'll tell me how much to obligate. If I have a severable service that is 13 months, how much of current appropriation do I obligate? Let me put that out there first. It's a severable service. It is a 13-month contract. But let's say today is 31st of January, and I have a severable service contract that is just awarded. How much of current year appropriation do I obligate on that contract? Or can I obligate? Any taken?
Only 12 months.
Only 12 months. So your limit when you're dealing with contracts is how much to obligate is 12 months is your limit. So it doesn't matter if it crosses fiscal year, if you're doing a contract for a severable service and it's a 13-month contract, I'm going to obligate 12 months of current appropriation, and then for that other month, it'll be subject to availability of funds. So 12 months is your limit. As you read through those two paragraphs on page 19, that's what it's talking about. The difference now with a non-severable, as I stated, if I'm paving the parking lot out there because it has a lot of potholes, I need the whole parking lot paved. So I can obligate the full amount of the job. So most of these are like a one-time project. So it's not like an ongoing. That's another difference there. So non-severable, you obligate the full amount of the contract at the time of award. Any question on the difference between severable, non-severable, how much to obligate, when you obligate? Any question? A lot of time it throws individuals when you start crossing fiscal year, but think again on the contract side. So severable, 12 months or less, obligate the full amount. If it says that it's a 15-month contract or whatever, the rest, anything above 12 will be obligated subject to availability of fund. If it's a non-severable contract, you will obligate the full amount regardless of it crossing fiscal year once it's awarded. All right. So bona fide need is basically stating current year needs, I'm going to use current funds. But remember that depending on whatever it is that you're buying, you may have a long lead time. If I need a new building by a certain date, I can't just obligate. I can't wait until FY25. If I need the building in October FY25, I cannot wait till October to get a contract. So bona fide need will say that it's okay to enter into that contract up to that point so that by the time I have the requirement, I can actually get that building completed. That was just an example. So bona fide need, the basic rule is current year needs, current funding or requirement. On page 20, there are two types of permissible actions when you get ready to spend appropriation. The one that I listed earlier was the second one. On the contract, the contracting office would typically write subject to availability, meaning we're waiting until Congress appropriates the money to determine how much additional is given. So subject to availability clause in a contract allows for final negotiation of that contract, but it prohibits the contractor from starting the work. Until we say we have the approved for the rest of the work, then they can continue. The first bullet, if you're new to the government, you might not be familiar with this, but there are certain times where the Department of Defense has its appropriation before 1 October. So if the Appropriation Act is enacted prior to the start of the fiscal year, so before 1 October, for which the appropriation is made, then we can enter into contracts for that fiscal year. What am I talking about? So let's say it's September and Congress has appropriated the defense budget for FY25, which is the next fiscal year. That means if I have a contract that begins in October, I could start the process with the contracting office August, September, when it appropriates, and cite that you have the approved funding for FY25. So those are the two permissible actions. Either way, Congress have to appropriate the funding, and what is it called when OMB issues the funds to the agencies? So Congress appropriates, and what does OMB do? What is it called when OMB issues the funds?
Apportionment.
Apportionment, correct. We got somebody awake today. All right. And then when OMB issues to the agency the apportionment, agency being Department of Defense, then Department of Defense issues what to the rest of us?
Allotments.
Allotments. All right, there we go. When you're studying, I also recommend talking out loud to hear yourself say it, because sometimes you can catch something by hearing it out loud. All right, so page 21 now talks about if I have a contract in place, there are obligation rules for if I have to cancel or terminate a contract. You can either terminate for convenience of the government, that is in most, actually all the contracts I've seen, they always have that clause in there, convenience of the government. If the government no longer wants that contract or that service, then they can cancel with no penalties. However, you may have a contractor default, meaning that contractor failed to provide all those tasks that are listed in their contract, and they have to be fired. The most time I see this is in the deployed location, because those contractors have a different standard than the Americans. And so something that they might say is good to go, we might say no, electrical problems, and so forth. So contractor default. The key here is determining if a contractor is fired, they completed a certain amount of the work, you as the contracting officer representative or COR signs off and said, yep, the job is good, they did the work. That means the government owes that contractor up until that point for the work they completed. After that, we have to, once they fire that old contractor, we have to get a new contractor to complete the work. So us working with the KO, the contracting office, because we're not the ones going out finding these new contractors, but we are responsible for the funding side of it. So if a bona fide need still exists, I'm on page 21, first paragraph, and the replacement contract does not exceed the scope of the original, because you always have those good idea fairies who they didn't think about it when the first contract was put in place. So now we have a contract to default and we got to get a new contract. They might come up with new ideas. What this is saying is you cannot start new ideas when you get a deal with contract to default. You got to get a second contractor to complete the work. And so as we are increasing a contract or we are increasing a requirement, we need to make sure of those things. Working with the KO. And the replacement contract is to be awarded in a reasonable time frame. So you can't fire the one contractor this year and you wait until the next fiscal year to get a new contractor. You don't want to do that. So the best thing, if you want to change the scope and you got new things that you didn't consider before, is to submit a new requirement for approval for new funding to fund that requirement. Any question on those obligation rules for contract termination? simply means you got to take whatever's left or what was already appropriated for that particular contract or allotted for that particular contract to get another contract. Of course, it may require an increase because most contractors, if they have to fix what somebody else did, they're going to charge you more. All right, page 22 starts appropriation life and appropriation life cycles. So we know we have appropriations that have a single life, they're annual, 1 year, multi-year, and there's some that do not expire. That's your no-year appropriation. And we're going to touch a little bit on the no-year. Make sure you know what's the next, I think, 3 pages, you pay attention. On page 23, that chart is very good. MILPERS and O&M are your 2-year appropriations. It says, it explains what it's used for. MILPERS, you pay folks, military personnel with it. O&M, we talked about your day-to-day travel, training, all of that miscellaneous stuff, recruiting is covered in O&M. But what I want you to see in O&M in the 2020 study guide, you can also use O&M funding for minor construction up to $2 million. So that means you do not have to have military construction dollars, because that's another appropriation, to do that work, because you can use O&M if it's $2 million and they deem, all your approving official says that's a minor construction and it's under $2 million, you can use O&M for $2 million, up to $2 million. The next bullet under that one says you can use O&M to purchase items with investment type unit cost. If you look under procurements, SCN and Milcon, all of those say investment type on the far right. So we're mainly talking about procurement, buying something. And so if that procurement is less than $250,000, operations and maintenance funds can be used. So I think this is the only spot where you're going to see this information, but it's still viable for Module 1. So minor construction up to $2 million, procurement of investment items less than $250,000. RDT&E, research development, test and evaluation, is a 2-year appropriations. And I'll talk about these in a little bit after I go through this. Procurement, 3 years, investment type. Shipbuilding, conversion, Navy, and military construction are both 5-year appropriation. What this chart is telling you, those are the timeline in which those appropriations are available for new contracts, new obligations. So if you have a procurement and you just got it, you have 3 years to use those funds. However, there's always restriction that says you have to spend a certain amount each of those 3-year period. They don't just let you sit the money there for 3 years and wait till the 3rd year. Page 24 talks about the no-year appropriation. 31 U.S. Code 1555. That's the no year. There are 2 conditions of when you can close a no year. So first of all, the primary or number 1 appropriation that is a no year appropriation that is used by the Department of Defense is the Defense Working Capital Fund. And that will come up again in certain parts of the CDFM. The working capital fund is the same thing. Think about your commissaries. Everybody know what a commissary is? That's where you go to buy the groceries on the installation. The commissary takes their funding, just like on the civilian side. They put the food item on the shelf. In the beginning of the fiscal year, they say how much they're going to charge the customer for those food items. The customer comes in, pays for the food items, and that money revolves in that commissary. The difference between the commercial side and the working capital fund, the goal of the working capital fund is to break even. So the next year, when they're coming up with their prices, and the next year, they have to look at their trends to make sure that each year they're not earning a profit and profit and profit. That means even if they would have charged us $5 for a steak, they have to lower it now to maybe $4 because they've consistently earned a profit. But the bullets on page 24 says the two reasons how you can close, because I said no year or X fund, X as in X-ray, is a no year appropriation. The two reasons you can close a no year account is the head of the agency. Agency to us is the Department of Defense, Department of State, Department of Education. They're the agency concerned, or the president determines that the purpose for which that appropriation was made have been carried out, if reach is life cycle. Or if there's no disbursement within that appropriation for 2 consecutive fiscal years. Nothing been charged, nothing been bought, nothing been paid out of that no year appropriation. 31 U.S. Code 1555. Now, the chart at the bottom of page 25, the diagram appropriation life cycle. If you see it again, it will not be in this format. It will be in the format of knowing the life cycle of those appropriations. What am I talking about? For instance, if I say today, I'm going to give you all a scenario. Let me see which one I want to use. Usually they like to use the old years because we can't think back in 2012. All right. If I say today is November the 5th, 2012, you just received shipbuilding conversion Navy funding. When will these funds be closed? So based on appropriation life cycle and knowing how long that appropriation, does anyone want to take that? I'll repeat it again. See if anybody want to try to give me an answer. Today is November the 5th, 2012. You just received shipbuilding conversion Navy funding. When will these funds be closed? All right, I'll wait a few minutes. Miss Elise, did I see you? Go
Yes.
ahead. Okay, Elise.
Is it I say 2017, 5 years from it. Was it November the 4th? Or the fiscal year? It should be
Okay.
the end of 2017, which be September 30th, 2000.
Okay, we'll come back to you. All right, go ahead, Mr. Rodriguez. We'll come back, Miss Elise.
Okay.
That will be November 2017.
Okay, what was my question? Let me go back there. What's the question you're trying to answer? Because you're gonna have to do this on the exam, I promise you.
Is
And
it
you have to
23?
remember.
Period
ahead.
of it.
Is it 23?
No, okay, hold on, Miss Tricia. What was the question I asked y'all to solve?
When will the funds close?
When will the funds be closed? Because if you look on page 25, it says every appropriation goes through phase 1 when it's current, phase 2 when it's expired for 5 years, and then it's closed after that. So Miss Tricia, what was your response? What's
Is it fiscal year 23?
Fiscal year 23 is the correct response. So let's walk it through. Because if you see it again, it's not going to be straightforward. It's going to be just like I gave it to you. So first of all, we need to know what fiscal year we're in. So we say it's November the 5th, 2012. So what fiscal year are we in?
13.
Fiscal year 13. Okay, so we're starting with 13. Then I said we have shipbuilding conversion Navy funding. How long are those funds in phase 1?
5 years.
5 years.
5 years.
So that's 15, that's FY 13, 14, 15, 16. Yes, and I see how you got the 17. And also, I'm gonna let you know on an exam, you're probably gonna see FY 17, for instance. Not this particular question, but when you write a test exam, we always think of what are the possible responses that the individual will pick. So your first response, for those who say 17, you would have saw 17 and you probably would be like, yep, there's 17, and click. So make sure you're walking through and thinking of what you're doing. What is the question asking you? I asked when it's closed. So that means you have to go the extra step. So I know that it is current in phase 1 from FY 13 to FY 17. But it didn't ask me for current. It also did not ask me for expired, but from page 25, I can see that every appropriation stays expired. So after that initial 5 years, it stays expired for an additional 5 years. So that's up to 10 years for shipbuilding conversion Navy. So that means the shipbuilding conversion Navy in this example is in the expired state from which years?
5 years.
Okay, what are my 5 fiscal years? So we ended with FY 17. It was current up until 17. So what's my next 5 years?
FY 18,
18.
FY 19. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23.
Let's stop at 22. That's 5. 18, 19, 20, 21, 22.
22.
You know I'm old school. I still use my fingers, so don't talk about me. That's how we grew up. 1, 2,
Mhm.
yeah. All right, so it's expired from FY 18 to FY 22. That's the 5-year period. That means these funds are now closed in FY 23. So for those that are new to the financial management world, what that says is in FY 23, if we have shipbuilding conversion Navy from 2012, we were still dealing with those fundings. So I could give you one more just to get you all, since you got a better idea now. Walk through, regardless of what the question asks, once you figure that it's asking you for the appropriation life cycle, go ahead and figure out the current, the 5-year expired fiscal year, and the close or cancel. All right, let me give you all another example. And they like using older years, so I'm gonna give you all an old one. Let's see, 6, 7. All right, today is 3 December 2005. You just received procurement funds. When will these funds be expired? All right, so how about you give me the current or open, current, expired, and closed. Let's just walk through all of it. So again, today is 3 December 2005. You received procurement funds. When will these funds be current, expired, and closed? All right, so the first question is, what's the first question you should ask yourself?
The current fiscal year.
What current fiscal year are you in? If it's 3 December 2005, what's your fiscal year?
2006.
And based on the procurement will tell you how long it stays in phase 1. So we start with 2006 because we know that's 3 December 05 is fiscal year 6. All right, so how long is it in current?
Until 2010.
Oh, somebody give her a lifeline, help her out.
2011.
2008.
2008, stay with me, Miss Elise.
It's a 3-year.
Remember, you gotta look, remember procurement, and if you don't remember, just go back to page
Oh, yeah, I see
23.
it.
Page
Okay.
23 on the far right, procurement is a 3-year. So it's current fiscal year 6, 7, and 8. And then you go into expired. So how long is the appropriation expired? Every appropriation is expired for how many years?
5.
5 years. So for this example, what's the 5-year period? From
9 to 13.
9 to 13. So then these are closed what fiscal year?
14.
14.
Hmm.
So the knowledge of the appropriation life cycle on page 25, that is what you need to remember about it, is exactly what I did. What fiscal year you in? And I used to teach again the PEEP course, and I remember that we used to have questions like this, and individuals get flustered when you try to figure out what fiscal year are you in. I was like, if you start there, remember 1 October of one year to 30 September of the next year, that's your fiscal year. Everything operates on fiscal year, not calendar. All right, so let's go back now to what's listed on the page 25. If it's current, that means it's available for new obligations to be started. When the appropriation enters the expired state, what can you do with that appropriation? I can start a new contract, or what can I do with it in the expired state?
Only
Uh,
payments and adjustments.
Payments and adjustments. That means I have to already have had a MIPR, a contract, a WBS, or something that started that previous year. And once it expires, within that 5-year period, the only thing I can do is upward and downward adjustments. No new obligations. And then what happens once it goes into phase 3, which is closed or canceled? Just like we're closing out FY19 this year. So what's going to happen when it comes 1 October of this year and those FY19 funds? What's going to happen to them? Where do they go? They just evaporate.
Back to the treasury.
Back to the treasury, specifically in the miscellaneous receipt account of the treasury, because it's going to come up somewhere again. And I don't remember where that's stated. So the miscellaneous, so when it expires and then it goes to cancel, the canceled amount of FY19, for instance, for this year, will go evaporate back into the treasury. And the treasury do whatever they do at their level with it. However, let's say you got a bill, because you got an invoice that comes in and you say, oh, this contract FY19, but it's FY25 now. Oh, that's canceled. There's an exception to the rule on page 27, the second paragraph, or the second, major area. It says the 1% requirement. What that 1%, and I think it's listed under, it's in small print on page 25 also. It's basically saying if you receive an invoice on a canceled account, you can use up to 1% of your current appropriation, that's exactly the same color of money, to pay that legitimate obligation. If you don't want to tell the contractor, oh, well, go to DFAS because these funds are already canceled. If you have the funding and you want to go ahead and settle the account, you have the 1% rule. A note shall be appended to each apportionment that says, pursuant to 31 U.S. Code 1553, not to exceed 1% of the total appropriation for this account is a portion for the purpose of paying legitimate obligation related to canceled appropriation. So when the funds trickle down, that is the 1% requirement or 1% rule is already attached to it. So all of that rolls into the time, 31 U.S. Code 1502. And then on page 27 in the middle, it begins the 88 violation for 31 US code amount, 1341, 1342, 1517. You need to know the difference between them. So page 28 for 1341 says an officer or employee of the U.S. government may not make or authorize an expenditure obligation exceeding an amount available in an appropriation or fund for the expenditure of obligation. You can't spend before you get the appropriation. Involve the government in a contract or obligation for the payment of money before an appropriation is made unless authorized by law. So basically saying, I cannot spend a certain amount or any amount unless I have the authority to do so. 1341 is straightforward, but it's talking about appropriation. So the key here is to look at appropriation. They're going to bring up apportionment and allotment. Because who gets appropriation within our flow of funds? The appropriation goes to OMB. OMB apportions, DOD issues allotment, or the agencies. So that's going to come into effect. 1341. Page 3129 talks about various budget authority. Appropriations gives us the authority to spend money. Contract, borrowing, offsetting collections receipt, loan and loan receipt. You got a list of things. If you know what these 5 are, if they add another one and they say which one is not a form of budget authority, you'll be able to pinpoint it. So make sure you know the different forms. Page 30 talks about concept of earmarking, those additional limitations that Congress can put on the appropriation. They can put ceilings. They can say you cannot exceed $5 million to do this project. Put floors, say you have to spend at, if they want to make sure you spend money on a project, they'll say they put a floor on it. You have to spend at least 2 million and so forth, or they put a fence around it. You can only use these appropriations for this particular purpose. So these are additional earmarking that Congress can place. The second ADA violation for amount is page 31. 1342 deals with voluntary services. What you need to know from here is if the compensation is fixed by law, that means a budget position is a GS-12. It says I cannot accept someone come in and say, you know what, I just want to train to keep my technical competency up. Can I come in and help? I'll help you do your work. You don't have to pay me for something that's deemed a GS position or whatever the other classifications are. So if it's a position or job that is fixed by law, I cannot accept voluntary services. That is the first bullet on page 31. The second one says, if the level of compensation, that means that I can lower the payment to 0. And the only job I can think of is like a family readiness group, the FRD. In the past, they never used to get paid, but I think there's some paid positions now. Let's say in that description of the job, and it says that that particular director or supervisor has the ability to lower it to 0. That means you can accept someone coming in and volunteering to do that job. So for the most part, we cannot accept volunteers unless the third one says that organization already has the statutory authority. They have the right, they have the legal ability to stand on, such as your Red Cross volunteers, candy stripers in the hospitals, and your museum volunteers. There's already regulations or laws out there that authorize these individuals to volunteer and work for free. So 1341 says I cannot spend in excess or before I get appropriation. 1342 deals with voluntary services. And then on page 32, it goes into apportionment. US Code 1517. So think about the funding flow on page 33. If I'm violating appropriation, that should let you know that who can violate appropriation, which agency can violate appropriation. If I cite 31 US Code 1341 for violating appropriation, which agency do you think could be deemed have violated appropriation? Can you take us? That will be OMB, because OMB receives appropriation. So depending on the term being used, because if it wasn't a difference, they wouldn't need 1517. Because 1517 says, an officer or employee of U.S. government may not make or authorize an expenditure of obligation exceeding an apportionment. Only the agencies receive apportionment. So between the people that can violate apportionment is the agencies, such as Department of Defense. Now, does that mean that at our level, since we receive allotments, that we cannot violate apportionment? Can we commit the ADA violations at our level? And I got a lot of people with different backgrounds, so
Yes.
please, we can. Well, how so? So we still have to follow the rules of use of these appropriations, right? So yes. Now, typically, if you committed a violation, and a lot of times it's a error. You know, hey, I used the wrong appropriation for this. And there's some where you can see blatantly where they wanted to circumvent the, hey, you need military constructions or you need procurement, so you split purchase so you can get what you want. You could tell those too. But yes, at our level, we need fiscal law. We need to know that we can also violate, but our hire will tend to look and see if they had the proper funding. If it's something that it wasn't your fault, you didn't really try to defraud the government. So could they fix it? But there's some instances that it cannot be fixed or it will not be fixed. So it trickles back up to the agency and then it becomes a violation of apportionment. So the DOD, nobody can fix whatever the issue is. So then it's reported as a 31 US Code 1517 violation. So that's the difference between 1341 and 1517. One's violating the appropriation, one's violating the apportionment. And if you ever go on gao.gov, there's an area where they talk about these ADA violations. And you see some of the amounts are real small. So that also tells me there's some other, whether it's law violations or something else tied to it, why they got reported and no one fixed it on the way up. Page 33, fund flow. Again, you got all of your appropriation, Congress appropriates, OMB issues apportionment once the agencies complete an SF 132. This was also stated in Module 1, so I'm just recapping. Then the agency, such as Department of Defense, issues allotment. The rest of us, we commit the funds, administratively set money aside, obligate, we enter into contracts and legally bind the government, and outlay. The only time you will see the word disbursement is on the bullet at the very last bullet on page 33. Finally, the government liquidates the obligation by making a disbursement or outlay. In the CDFM, outlay is the proper term for when the funds are removed from the treasury to pay a bill. All right, so any question on purpose, time, and amount? Because the rest should go by pretty much faster. All right, Augmenting your funds on page 34, you may not augment. And I think, let's see. I don't know if y'all remember when we talked about, I think, manpower management in module 1, I talked about honorarium. You cannot augment your pay. So that's why if you're operating on your official capacity, if you're going to speak at your alma mater and they're inviting you on your official capacity because you're a budget analyst for the Department of Defense, that means you're augmenting your pay. So you cannot. So make sure that is worded because you are a graduate, you're an alumni of that organization, then you don't violate this augmentation law. Page 35, again, is a repeat of the gifts. And if you notice, the last paragraph on page 35 refers you back to module 1, competency 2, manpower management, where it talks about receiving gifts or gifts to an employee. If you receive gifts from the contractor in a calendar year, it cannot exceed how much? Gifts from a contractor, what's my limit in a year of gifts that I can accept?
50.
50.
$50, right? And in a single gift, what's the value of that one gift? Cannot exceed $20.
20.
So I'm recapping what was in manpower management, module 1. And likewise, let's see. When you're buying a gift or contributing to a gift of a supervisor, employees are limited to a $10 gift. And that's a donation. It's not mandatory. So if they come around and they make you feel like you have to donate, that's a no-no. All right, what do we do with ADA violations on page 36? You can either have administrative penalties or criminal penalties. So this is if there's no violations of the law in other instances other than fiscal law. So administrative means I can counsel the individual, I can sit them aside, I can retrain. There's other administrative things that can be done, or criminal. If there's, hey, they did it on purpose type of things, there's a $5,000 fine, 2-year imprisonment could be imposed just strictly from using the wrong appropriations, wrong timeline, or both. $5,000, 2-year imprisonment, or both. ADA reporting requirements. If you identify on page 37, you have some timelines that you need to see, recognize in the first paragraph. Based on DoD Financial Management Regulation, DoD FMR, Volume 14, and they give you the paragraph, it requires a notice of suspected Anti-Deficiency Act violation to a hire within 2 weeks. 2 weeks can be listed as 10 days, because I've seen in the old study guide, it used to say 10 days. So make sure you say 10 days or 2 weeks. And then the end of that paragraph says the preliminary review should be completed within 4 months from the date of discovery, the initial discovery, and should include those following information. So you have notify once you identify, oh, this is an ADA violation of purpose, 31 U.S. Code 1301, time 1502, amount 1341, 1342, or 1517, then you have 4 months to complete that initial review, preliminary review. ADA relief on page 38. They give you some examples, but it says, in light of the explicit provisions of 31 U.S. Code 1351, it has been held that there is no private right of action for relief. So there's no right like, okay, I made a mistake. We make mistakes daily. So it's like, if you make a mistake, you identify it, determine the legal way to correct your mistake. because there is no particular right to say, I need to be relieved because I didn't mean to do it. Not in our job. And then they give you some examples of violations, so I'm not going to go over that. Continuing resolution begins on page 41. And this is another reason why I recommend that you guys read all 3 modules before you settle down on, okay, now I'm gonna take my first exam, because in module 1, I think you had 1 page on continuing resolution, if I'm not mistaken. And here in module 3, you have about 4 pages. So just remember, a continuing resolution is a temporary appropriation stopgap. I don't want the government to shut down based off of Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 that we learned today. And so no new starts. So just think of all the rules associated with the CR. And you must operate on the same rate of operation as you did in the previous fiscal year. So that all sums up from page 41 to page 44. Now, on page 44, there's a question asked, because I know way back when I saw this question on my exam in a similar way. If you obligate under a CR, and I think I asked it last week, if you obligate under CR based on current rate, and then Congress finally appropriates at a lesser rate, have you committed an ADA violation? And the answer to that question is no. Because as long as you're operating under the rules at that time of the CR, and then Congress comes back later and gives you a less amount, that does not mean that you've committed a violation. Any question? I'll come up for some air. All right. Page 45, sequestration. You hear this term all the time. All it is automatic spending cut. So Congress appropriates the money, and then we can also sequester funds. And just think about it. Anytime anything is done with these appropriations, if the president no longer needs a particular funding in a category that Congress gave it to him, they always have to go back to Congress to request permission. A term that is mentioned on page 45 is the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990s. Talks about the Graham-Rodham-Hollins Act, and it revised the federal government budget control. It talks about the pay-as-you-go process. And basically is you stop doing one thing to use that money, once you get approval, to use that money to do something else. So you pay as you go. You don't get additional money. In the past, we used to get, supplemental. That's additional money on top of what's approved. That was like years and years ago, but they don't do that anymore. So pay as you go. Page 46 again addresses government shutdown. Now you know that's tied to Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7. That is why the government shuts down. And I think in here it tells you of the time when the government did actually shut down. For those that are new, it would be like, oh, they just talk about it. They don't actually do it. Some of us been around a while, and there have been instances where you get like half a paycheck. I'm like, okay, this is not gonna work. I'm gonna need y'all to figure it out. Send me my money. But it does, your payment can stop. It doesn't, you're gonna get paid eventually, but if it does go through that this is a full-fledged government shutdown, the paychecks will stop. Now, I don't know if that means that the bill collectors are gonna also stop and understand that you didn't get your paycheck, but we didn't get, I think we only happened for like a week. So you had enough time to adjust. All right, accountable individuals, page 47 are your list on the top of the diagram. Department, accountable officials, certifying officers, dispersing officers. So this is a list of those that can be accountable individuals. There wasn't much what I had going through. Advanced decisions on page 49 is basically just saying before, if you're not sure of a decision that you got to make, a purchase you got to be made, like we do, go to your ethics lawyer, go to your legal folks and get a legal opinion that is okay for you to use appropriation to make that purchase. Relief of accountable individuals on page 50. There's some instances where the Comptroller General, again, the individual in charge of GAO, must grant relief under certain conditions. A physical loss. So if your dispersing officer has money, the Secretary of Defense determines that the official was carrying out their official duties. You didn't do anything that, excuse me, resulted in the illegal improper payment. However, the Secretary of Defense has delegated DFAS, the Director of DFAS, to determine those relief. Determines that all these criteria apply, the Comptroller General must grant relief. So DFAS at the DOD level is the entity will determine when they report that to the Comptroller General that these particular conditions require relief. Page 51, statute of limitations is important. If it's an error, that means I made an error, I used the wrong appropriation, I put an extra zero that I shouldn't or whatever, is 3 years from the time the Comptroller General receives the account, not 3 years from when the actual activity occurred. If it's a fraud, there's no statute of limitation. So that is why it's important for us to know fiscal law, to know the use. So regardless if the lawyer says it's okay to do something and you know as the financial manager, that's illegal, I would not advise you to sign any document. There was one instance where I had deployed with an organization. I told them no, not to do something. They went around me, they did it, they got the service, and then they didn't get approval first, and then the contractor had to be paid. And I think I had redeployed maybe 2 or 3 years later, and then I was getting these emails like, hey, do you know anything about this? But they couldn't find my signature on any of the documents because I already told them no, that's illegal. So if you are part of a financial manager where you obligate funds and all of this, or approve, certify, make sure that you are following these guidelines, because there's the statute of limitation for fraud is no time limit. So again, the basic idea behind fiscal law is it must be stated in writing by Congress that you can use those appropriations to make that particular purchase. Or if it's using O&M, you still got to make sure within the O&M arena, is there some method of payment to buy this item, to get it? Is it already provided somewhere else? All right, so looking at some of the terms on page 52, 53, the one in the middle that says 41 U.S. Code 6301. I don't think I've seen it anywhere else, but I have multiple people always tell me they see it somewhere else. So make sure you know the Feed and Forage Act, 41 U.S. Code 6301. Basically what it does, it authorizes the Department of Defense to spend money that they don't have if they deploy somewhere and they need clothing, food, fuel. It's something to do with health, medical and hospital supplies, not to exceed their necessities. So let's say that the funding flow is a little bit slow on what they are actually authorized. If they go and they deploy and they need those items, they go from one extreme weather to another extreme weather, and they did not have the right gear, they need to go ahead and purchase it to protect their personnel. So the Feed and Forage Act is only authorizes the Department of Defense to incur in excess. So if they can justify this, that means they are not violating 31 U.S. Code 1502 for amount spending before they have something. Any questions? Feed and Forage Act, 41 U.S. Code 6301, page 54, let's see, sequestration, Treasury warrant, again, when Congress appropriates the money, two things happen. The Treasury issues a Treasury warrant, and OMB begins the apportionment process. That's the two sides that happen. Ms. Pamela, did you have a question? I'm sorry. Looks like you was trying to say something. Okay, I don't hear anything. Okay, this concludes. I guess I've been doing this long enough where we got like 4 minutes, but right on the clock.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there you go.
Okay,
No,
I apologize. So going back to the Feed and Forage Act,
okay.
now how would you annotate something like that, I guess, on your spending document? So if you make that payment, if you pay something like that, how would you annotate it? Or how should that be annotated on a document?
In most instances, before you even deploy, there what are fund codes that you can use. And so there's other mechanism you can put into place because you don't know if you're going to need it sometimes until you get on ground. So these are usually for instances, let's say it's a natural disaster and they're activating forces to go from one state to a next state. And they get to a place where there's a blizzard. And okay, well, we came from South Carolina, we don't have the right clothing, so we may need to buy clothing. So it's all part of your cost tracking your costs, your functional cost accounts, whatever you set up to capture those costs of that action, that mission is what you would justify that, okay, this falls under. And I would cite 41 U.S. Code 6330 based on 41 U.S. Code 6301, Feed and Forage Act, and making sure it's got something to do. So basically an emergency situation where you arrived and you didn't know you were going to need those items. I don't know if that helps, but these are steps that you have to put in your organization if you're deploying, and if your unit is deploying somewhere, whether stateside or overseas. Does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. And there's some exercises if you want to practice those. I think if you have the study guide, the answers are on one of the, I don't remember if it's the glossary, somewhere in the book. I have to go back through. I don't normally go through these. All right, this looks like we have come to the end of CDFM Module 1. And today we covered CDFM Module 3, Competency 1, which focuses on fiscal law. But again, it still overlaps with what we did in Module 1. So the next 2 weeks is basically a review of me asking questions, putting out some more information, but I'm not going to go through the study guide as I did. I might pick some topics and we're going to talk about it because on the exam, it will not be broken down by competency. It'll just be a series of questions that is asked of you. And so my goal is to trigger some questions so that you be able to think like that and the answers will come to you. All right, if there are no additional questions, I'll pause. All right. All right, this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM Study Group. Please subscribe to our YouTube page if you have not done so already to bring more visibility to our YouTube channel. Thank you for stopping by. This is Helen Thomas and the CDFM Study Group.